You have the play dates.
Video chat.
You're past that.
Well, we have season tickets to the Eastern Broadway. She was just calendaring it for the next season. I was like, I don't remember the last time we had a play date. But, miscommunication.
We went to see Lion King.
That's good, wasn't it?
It's good. We don't have, years ago, we had season tickets for things that we kept missing, so we just make it good. But, we had given Eleanor and Wells, that is part of the reason. And we were impressed. We knew Eleanor would like Wells.
Oh, yeah. You know, I guess puppetry, I don't know what you're calling it. We had, we saw it 20 years ago before it.
Barely, but it is.
Definitely holds up.
Yeah. Wells watched the movie in his mom's way.
Yeah.
So he was really more in tune with some than Eleanor was.
We took Bryan there once when he was little, and then every birthday, that's where he would go. Not because he liked the food, but because he wanted to watch all the entertainment. So it ended up being an expensive mistake. Because it was like,
I know, I looked at the children's menu prices. I know. But I have to admit, my two A-graders, they're good.
yeah, he did like it. It was just like, okay.
See the new place up here? So I haven't been yet.
Which one's that?
Kroger.
Okay.
It's gonna be a hibachi sushi.
Okay.
And it just opened this week. So I'm like, let's go. Stay in dishes. That Italian place, yeah.
You gotta sell a lot of deals at the same time.
I'm not a sushi.
I always think that about it.
I could go for the sushi.
I could be honest. Eleanor and Dennis love sushi, so they got.
Shooting this time is always one.
I mean, people love it or hate it, and
My
that's probably
first
the only
church
thing I
when I was
don't
a
eat
student
is
pastor, Bryan,
probably what I should eat because
the
it's probably.
franchisees.
I want mine cooked with some kind of breading sauce. Peanut or butter.
Back then I could eat it all. They did something weird. They would do chilies.
And they like that.
We have one of those like some griddles and Eric will do he'll do that meat like that. I have some good marinades. There's some good, I'll do chicken and beef and then he'll do the fried rice on there. And it really does. It's just that he doesn't like to cook in summer.
It really does. I mean, the only thing I really noticed about it.
So we call it like a winter small meal.
They were tight. They
Eleanor likes the fried rice.
They would give the staff of that church.
Wow.
So she was they were saying
They basically actually gave us credit at a local bookstore so we could go in there and get our, from the course of the year, get your free. I mean, we ate on the committee. We ate on that all year long. That was a kind gift. Yeah, we learned, I admit we also had to cook a lot.
this little thing where they lift the spatula and the heartbeat and the bone.
Anything you take stews.
I use
We all taste
How are you?
frozen
Good.
peas and carrots, so you don't have to chop those. You make it nice with the onion.
Judy?
Helen
talked to Mike and Joyce yesterday, and I was telling Terry, I said, you be sure and pass this on to Judy.
Trying to teach Savannah the life of it.
She
She's only
makes this
one, she's
chicken
only
spectacular.
Oh, yeah.
And so she gave me the
But I had her at the house
wow.
last night, and I was making the
So I made
stand her up in a chair.
And so she called me last night and she said they had some for lunch. And then she said later in the afternoon, Mike said, can we have some more chicken casserole?
He liked it that much.
So I
That's
said,
awesome.
I said, be sure and pass that on
That
to
is a,
Judy.
yeah, she makes that for us on Wednesday nights sometimes.
I know, because that's where I first had it.
Yeah, yeah.
And so it was so good, and I asked her, should I please come in?
Well, that's fun.
She did.
Her eyes got so big, the
I
plate
was
just
just so
finished on the mixer, I let her turn the mixer on the flip one time, and she just, so you get what you get, yeah.
If he weighs 100 pounds,
It's always like.
oh gosh, it's so
You're good.
sad.
You're rolling.
It's good to see everybody today. We're glad you're here, and we're glad that the rain has cooled things off, but at least no flooding right where we are. We'll pray for any of those who get a few floods out of this. Well, today we're on chapter 7, which means we look back at the soul training from last time, which was about finding somebody who can hold you accountable. And so there's a couple of questions. One, were you able to do this? You can answer this at your table. If it did, did that time with them affect you in any way? If you say, well, no, I didn't do this, then maybe think back in your past. When was a time someone held you accountable in a helpful way? So maybe you can think back in your life and think, I didn't necessarily like it when they held me accountable, but it proved helpful. And then maybe what are reasons that we resist having accountability in our lives? So take just a few minutes to visit with your table about those questions, and then we'll move on to this week's chapter.
I think our Bible study group is our, we're all neighbors and friends, so I always see that as like, yeah. It's nice. They're so close. Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, 5 minutes. So he doesn't go on for 25 minutes. Just get it off your chest and pray together.
I haven't gone to the extent. So I'm still a little embarrassed. Earlier on, I had we stopped smoking.
We were right next door, so we saw each other driving down the driveway today. And our families are close, so there were some times that, yeah, and a couple of things, we're like, really? I didn't see it, but trust me, looking back, I miss her anyway, but for a lot of reasons. She was there when I was raising my kids.
You're just sitting there with your spouse saying, the times you felt like
They still live, Susan, yes, they're there, she's got some problem.
Did they get married?
Yeah.
I didn't know that.
But see, we don't live next door. Oh, okay, we'd be gone from here.
exceeded in humility.
But,
No, Jimmy.
it's a high school student.
Well, I took Sunday off.
Sister, always graduated.
Is she with it?
I'm working on it.
Said,
That's what happened to my dad when my mom died. Everybody starts calling the most eligible bachelor. Now he was only 53, so, yeah.
but you wouldn't think you
No, he's a very young man, very young.
They're
And I think she's
education.
maybe a year or two younger, they were in high school. So when they're
And he was actually preaching.
I had a friend too that we worked together. She's been on her spiritual journey and she got baptized in a new church she's on, so she moved to Fayetteville, so we went for her baptism.
Hard to believe that.
We shared everything. She's enough removed from my daily life. She has different perspectives.
We got one more year with John.
That's the only word we're allowed to lie.
All right, 1 minute, and then we'll move on.
Let's do, don't miss. All you get.
Outside of a spouse.
So I've had.
Well, I don't know.
Daughter?
All right, well, I hope we garnered some insights from one another.
Contacts.
We all need accountability, don't we? We tend to be blind to our own shortcomings, and so it's helpful to have somebody else who can point those out in a kind and gentle way, but also with some firmness, not to let us get away with it. We always find good excuses for our own misbehavior, don't we? And so we need somebody to keep us honest. Well, this week is really a chapter on generosity, and not just generosity to the church. We hear a lot about that at church, but this more specifically was primarily cultivating generosity towards the needs of others. And he starts off with a story that I think every pastor knows, where somebody comes to the church looking for help, and we're not always thrilled to offer that help. Pastors, it's just, if you've ever worked at a church, you know that people just show up, and they always have a story. Some of the stories sound the same, and it's easy to, because we know there are con artists out there, I've also, it's not always con artists, it's just people in need have learned to work the systems that exist in order to figure out ways to get what they need. And so, but it can make you a little jaded at times. And so he talks about how he helped, but not joyful. And we've all been there. So we've all been asked for help by people in need, both, folks who are on the street, but maybe in other experiences as well. So what are some of the feelings that show up in you when somebody in need asks you for help? We're not judging these feelings. We're just saying what's the honest.
Suspicion.
So sometimes we have suspicion. So what are we suspicious about?
If they're on the level.
Yeah, are they telling us the truth? Those kind of things. What else?
Yes, but if they are asking for help, for example, like someone who asked me about that he was hungry, and when I bought, sometimes was for him. Let me tell you, that guy just got one of the cargo pounds swallowed. That's it. And kept the other two. There were three. So I am not suspicious. The Lord knows, and He is the judge.
So maybe we have sometimes empathy. Sometimes we have both those at the once, same time, right? Empathy and suspicion. What else? Anybody ever have fear when somebody asks you for help? That can certainly be the case. Yesterday, we talk about what experiences we've had when trying to help the need. Yesterday, I was down at the Med Center visiting some church members, and I was walking back to the garage, and he looked homeless. Who knows if he was homeless, but he looked homeless. And he stopped and asked me if I had change for a Coke. That's at least what I heard him say. And nowadays, I don't have any cash on me at all. And I said, I don't have any change. And I'd buy the guy a Coke if he wanted a Coke, but we didn't get that far. Like, as soon as I said I don't have any change, he just started going off on me and saying, and either I didn't hear him correctly, or maybe he just, because then he starts really yelling at me about not everybody wants money, and I'm trying to have a conversation with him, but by that point he is, yeah, angry and walking away. And so, you know, I have a lot of compassion. I've spent a good portion of the early part of my career working in places of extreme poverty, and so, you know, compassion. But in that instance, there was no way to get beyond that initial encounter, and I'm empathetic, right? To live your life in constant need and to have to ask others for help. I mean, most of us don't like to ask for help. And so to have to live your life where you're constantly asking people for help probably creates a lot of issues. But that experience didn't go well. None of us like to be yelled at either. So it took me a minute to go, all right, well, there we go. So I've had other more positive experiences when helping people. What are some of the experiences you've maybe had while trying to help those in need?
And this has been probably about 40 years ago. Living in Lake Jackson, I was a member of the Methodist Church there. That's where I grew up, the Methodist Church. And the back end of the church paralleled and divided 4-lane highway. This is on a Sunday. Everybody had left except two of us, the youth director and myself. We were talking about, I don't remember exactly what it was, probably some youth activities. And a gentleman came in the back door, it was still open, and he was asking for help. He basically wanted some money. And so our pastors have left, except the youth director, we kind of chatted a little bit about that. And I said, okay, let me ask you some questions. And he told me that he came into town, he started a new job the very next day, looking for a place to stay, had very little money, and he needed some money to buy some gas and food for his family. So I walked out to his car. Sure enough, his wife's in the car, 2 kids, car full of clothes and money and stuff like that. I said, tell you what, you follow me, and we'll go down the road here, and I'll fill your car up with gas, and I'll go to KFC just right next to the gas station and buy you a family pack, and you can be on your way. And he accepted that. You know, it felt good to be able to help this gentleman, because I kind of believed that he was telling me the truth. I mean, he could have argued with me, well, I don't want to bother you, just give me the money. And I was reluctant to do that, but he fell right in line with my suggestions, and he went on his way. So that's one experience.
So I think most of us genuinely would want to help somebody who's genuinely hungry, right? It's a basic commandment of Jesus. We also can just imagine, you know, what it's like to not have enough food. And so most of us want to be able to help. And I think when we have opportunities to help in that way, it fills us with the joy of giving, like we talked about. We had a whole bunch of people show up last week when we put out short notice that we were going to help a ministry that we don't really know anything about in town. And we asked for 50 volunteers. We probably had 100 show up. We packed 3,500 meals in about an hour. And then I had people saying to me, "It's over already?" And those are all the supplies we had. And then our teenagers the next day went out and unloaded that in the sun. And so, you know, but there's joy in giving. So that's one experience.
This is a little bit different, but my sister and her husband, when they were newly married, and my brother-in-law was working and she worked, and she had a job, and he lost his job, and our dad died about the same time. And but my sister was still working, and they were not destitute, and they opened their mail, and somebody mailed them $1,000 check. And they to this day don't know who did that. They speculate that it was maybe their Sunday school teachers or somebody connected with the church, but it was not. They never asked for anything because they weren't in dire need. It was just a tough time in their marriage and in their life because they were newly married. But it was just somebody who anonymously mailed them a check. And like I said, they could, from the postmark, couldn't even tell, you know, like, is it somebody from here or somebody from wherever? And so I think they decided they would just pay it forward at some point to somebody else. But that was a you know, $1,000 for just out of the blue.
Yeah. So we hear stories of that where God provides. You know, I've heard stories in church life where other things like that, where God uses God's family to help others in a time of need. Sometimes we can be recipients of that. Alice and I, at our first congregation, you know, that church did not pay a whole lot. But there are only like 6 restaurants in town. And so we couldn't go to a restaurant and pay for our dinner. Like, it just inevitably somebody would pay for our dinner. Which actually got to be a little frustrating because the church wouldn't give us, you know, for Christmas or whatever, they give us some gift cards to one of the 6 restaurants in town. So we'd have to go eat there, and then they'd pay for our dinner. We're like, no, we got a gift card. We got to use this gift card. So, you know, God's people can be very generous in lots of ways. But we do know that while we have, I think most human beings, God places in us, we're made in His image. So I think even the worst of us sometimes enjoy being generous. And yet at the same time, because for lots of reasons, because we're also sinful, sometimes we're just selfish, sometimes we're suspicious, it can be difficult to be generous. I think also the longevity of our generosity. So one of the things that's challenging is, I'll tell you as a pastor, when you get that person who walks in when church is about to be over, you know, Terry was good in helping. Lots of times my thought is not how much this is going to cost me in money, but how much time is this going to cost me, right? I'm already tired, and if I'm really going to help them in a genuine way, is that going to go on and on and on? And we've all known, even with people we love, you know, family members sometimes need help, and we're glad to help, but then we also wonder, how long am I going to have to keep helping? And that starts to work against the other kind of self-protective aspects of our own personality. He lists some false narratives that also kind of keep us from being generous sometimes. And we'll see if we've ever believed any of these. And one is, God helps those who help themselves. You ever heard that statement before? You're our folks who study their Bible, so I'm assuming you know that's not in the Bible. In Benjamin Franklin, right? He wasn't really even a Christian. He was more of a deist. And we get the sense, right? There are Bible passages. I mean, you get the passage out of the Thessalonians that God wants us to work and do our part. But that one verse shouldn't be taken into a whole posture towards the rest of humanity because, well, we'll get to it in a second, of what God's posture towards us actually is. The other one is, if I give it away, I have less. And now, there's some basic truth to that, isn't there? I mean, if this guy has $50 in his pocket, if we give away the $50, do we have the $50 anymore?
No.
We don't. So there's a little bit of truth there, but we'll get to what he means there. And then I think this is the most pervasive in our culture. What I have is mine to use for my own pleasure. So if we have resources, we sit around and we think about, what do I want to use those resources for? When I do premarital counseling, one of the big things we'll talk about is your view of money. And so we all have a view of money. What is money for? And we often have different kinds of views. So in the little assessment that I give, it talks about some people see money as a source of security. And so if you see money as a source of security, what do you mostly want to do with your money?
Save it.
Yeah, keep it in the bank or investments. Some people see money as a source of pleasure. What do they want to do with that money? Yeah, but even that has subcategories. So some people like to spend their money on stuff because that gives them pleasure. Some people like to spend their money on traveling because they enjoy that. My wife and I are a little different like that. She would spend every dollar we have on travel if she could. And I'm not somebody who loves a whole lot of stuff, but I sometimes will want to buy something instead of go do something. And so we've had lots of discussions about that. And then, you know, money can be seen as a source of power. If you have money, it's a way of having influence in the world. And so we have different ways of seeing that, but all of those are ultimately focused on, if it's my money, I get to do what with it? Whatever I want. And our culture is definitely that way. So let's take these one at a time. God helps those who helps themselves. He says, really, the Bible teaches us over and over again that God helps those who cannot help themselves. So one of the great kind of myths of generosity is, we'll hear people say this all the time, well, we want to help somebody we want to help the worthy poor. And so what that means is, if we've got somebody who's poor, through no fault of their own, they're working hard trying to make it, but it's just not working, most people want to be generous towards that person. If you got a person, they're on drugs, they're doing all sorts of terrible things, they're in poverty, we tend to be less inclined to help that person. Now, we want to be wise always about the kind of help we get. Some help doesn't actually help. it can end up hurting. But that being said, in God's great generosity, the scriptures teach us, God is generous towards what kind of person? All of the above, right? Jesus says this in the Sermon on the Mount. You know, we're to really love our enemies because God our Father, he says he brings the sun and the rain on the just and the unjust. And so our generosity, really, it's godlike generosity, should not be conditioned on the worthiness of the recipient. Now again, there can be wise ways to help and unwise ways to help, but our posture should never be, well, this person doesn't deserve my help, so I'm not going to help them. That's not God kind of generosity.
Sometimes maybe I have limited resources to help people, and I want to help the person who can most give back to society. I mean, just a rationalization.
Yeah, I mean, and governments have to make those decisions, right? Governments have assistance programs, and so what are we going to do? And we understand, right? There's wisdom. But I do think in our practice of generosity, there is a kind of foolishness that is the foolishness of the gospel. So, right, Paul talks about in his letter to the Corinthians the really foolishness of the gospel, that some of our generosity in our lives ought to leave people scratching their heads. Like, why in the world would you be generous to that person? And that's because God is that kind of God. He is generous in that kind of way. I like this one. If I give it away, I will have less. And then he says, if we all share, we will have enough. He talks about the Omer principle. So he's talking about the manna in the wilderness, which is one of the Bible's, I think, premier stories about what does it mean to trust God to meet our needs. So in the wilderness, the Hebrew children are wandering around. They're hungry. God says they complain to Moses. God's going to provide a manna. So every morning they're going to wake up, and this manna is going to be on the ground, and they can go collect it to eat. But how much are they to collect? Just all that they can eat for that day. If they collect more than that, what happens to it? It rots, right? So it's this idea. Now, for the Sabbath, so that they wouldn't work on the Sabbath, the day before the Sabbath, they got to collect what?
2 days.
2 days. It is this idea that God will meet our daily needs. When we think of the Lord's Prayer, Jesus calls us, he invites us to pray for our daily bread. He doesn't say, pray for a week's worth of bread. Now, we live in a world of such abundance that it's, I think, sometimes difficult for us to imagine this. I'm the primary grocery shopper, at least during the school year, of our house, and every week, before I go grocery shopping, I go through the pantry to figure out, in the refrigerator, to figure out what is expired, right? So that there is food in there, that we've had so much food, we did not get to eat all of the food before it expired. That's the opposite of daily bread, isn't it? Now, part of that's my own fault. Alice and I, we have different views of money. We also have very different strategies of grocery shopping. Allison, when she grocery shops, and she does the grocery shopping in the summer while she's off of school, like, nothing delights Allison more than for it to be grocery day and for her to open the refrigerator and there be no food in there. Like, she really aims for us to eat every single thing she buys. Now, I grew up in a household where my mother was prepared for Y2K before that was a thing. You opened the pantry and there was enough food probably for 6 months in there.
Well, we
So
all learned that you have to have toilet paper.
that's right. So there is this tension in our lives. It's hard for us to think of what does it mean to daily trust God for our needs, or I think it's more for us on this thing. If I share what I have with others, will there be enough for me? Kind of a real lesson of this, and you've heard me tell this story before, but when we had the freeze, we own a generator. Our house never lost electricity, so we were maybe a day into that freeze, and we had not lost electricity, but many people had, and so I offered our generator to other people, and our children, and we also had like a little heater, and we offered that to somebody, so we were basically giving away all the stuff that could help keep us warm if our electricity went out. And first, my daughter had come to talk to me about it, and she said, well, what happens if it goes out for us? And I said, well, we'll worry about that when that gets here, but we're not going to hold on to stuff that can keep other people warm when they're cold. Well, then later, my son, in a more public setting with everybody in the room, asked basically the same question, and Sophie turns to him almost with exasperation in her voice and says something to the effect,
It's called generosity, John Curtis. You know, it's like, we don't like it, but it's what we're supposed to do. Now, I'll be honest, on this last go-round, we used our generator. We lost power for several days. And of course, we got our power back, and Allison almost immediately is offering our generator to other people. And yet I'm the one who had heard other people. I mean, Davey, I think, had lost electricity and then got it and lost again. I'm like, whoa, whoa, whoa. People are losing it again. I'm not sure I'm ready to farm out our generator. So I had to listen to my own lesson there. But there is this idea of, you know, if we share with others, will it be enough for me? The great Bible story that he alludes to in this chapter, of course, is the story with the young boy with the loaves and fish. That was his lunch. And you talk about there not being enough. He's looking out at a crowd of how many people? 5,000 men, so more than that. And he says, hey, here you go. And the great truth of this is not a truth. Let me phrase it this way. This is not an economic system truth. So this is not communism. If we all share, we'll have enough. This is the provision of God truth. That if we share what we have with others, God will bless that so that there is enough for them and for us. So he shares what is not enough. I mean, it's obviously not enough. But he shares it, and God blesses it, and it gives more than enough. There are baskets left over. That's such an important miracle in the New Testament that it shows up in all four Gospels. It's the only miracle outside of the resurrection that shows up in all four Gospels, which tells us it was very important in shaping kind of the ethos of the church. We are going to be a place that shares. My doctoral research was on the Lord's Supper. And in the early church, the Lord's Supper was often a part of a larger meal. And Justin Martyr was an early church leader, and in his writings, he gives specific instructions that the leftovers from that meal were to be distributed to the widows and the poor. So they would gather for the Lord's Supper, they would celebrate the abundant grace of God with a meal and the Lord's Supper, and then in further kind of, you know, a sign of that abundance, they would share with those in need. I think that's a beautiful picture of what we do. I also love this story from Dr. Carroll. It's not B.H. Carroll, who's a famous Baptist, but it's another Carroll, who gave the money, if you're a Baylor person, before they built their new, absolutely gorgeous science building. Their old science building was called the Carroll Science Building, and he was the man who gave the money for that. Now, he gave that back, this was early 1900s, before the Great Depression, so you have the great stock market crash, and Carroll loses almost everything he has. His wealth just disappears like so many people in that day. Well, he was later on campus, and of course the building's there with his name on it, but the person knows the circumstances of what has happened to him and says, do you regret giving all that money to Baylor to build this building? And he gave a powerful statement. He said, everything I kept for myself, I have lost. Everything I gave away continues to bear fruit. The building was still there. His bank accounts were not. That's a powerful lesson for life, isn't it? The Bible tells us that if we give generously to others, we will reap benefits in the kingdom of God. When you die, what's going to happen to all the money left in your bank account?
Don't care.
Somebody else gets it, right? And in the book of Ecclesiastes says it's probably going to be your kids, and they're not going to appreciate it. That's literally in the Bible. You know, he says they didn't earn it, they're not going to appreciate it, and all is vanity. The book of Ecclesiastes is a different book. So there is this idea, right? If we keep it to ourselves, we cannot take it with us. But if we give generously to others, that bears fruit in the kingdom of God in ways I don't think that we could really imagine. Then the last thing, what I have is mine to use for my own pleasure was, verse, what I have is God's to use for his glory. Now this is, anybody know this picture? You gotta be a movie buff a little bit. Okay, it's an older movie now, which dates all of us in this room. It's not that old. This is Denethor II, the Steward of Gondor. So this is from Lord of the Rings. And so we don't live in an age with stewards anymore, but the Lord of the Rings introduces people to the concept of a steward. So he is the steward of Gondor, the kingdom of Gondor. So what does that mean? Is he the king? No, there's a rightful king to Gondor, but he is missing in action. So the steward is serving in his place. But that does mean as steward, he has access to the riches of the kingdom. But does he actually own the riches to the kingdom? He doesn't. And in the movie especially, the book less so. He has problems in the book, but in the movie they especially run with him being greedy and self-indulgent. And really, he fails as a steward, and he essentially goes mad by the end of the movie. It's a very powerful image of, if we aren't good stewards with what we have been given, it isn't just unfaithful to the king, it's detrimental to our own souls. It's a powerful image. We all know, if we're good, faithful followers of Jesus, all that we have is from God. James tells us every good and perfect gift is from above, right? It's from God. And he, right, it's his to give and it's his to take away. We are given it to be stewards. That's why we talk about stewardship in church, that we are to be stewards of the gifts God gives us. If we use it for only our own pleasure, that's not really for the purposes of the kingdom, is it? Because the kingdom is to serve one another. And so this is a powerful picture. Now this is where it gets tough, because we still have things that we like. And to be good stewards and to be generous means holding the things God has given us loosely. I was having a conversation with a friend this week, and he was talking about during Harvey, they welcomed some friends into their house. They thought it would just be a few days. It ended up being several months because their house was destroyed. And he said he really felt bad for them because they're living in a little bedroom and a bathroom, but they're sharing meals and everything. But he said over time, the worst part of it was they had a dog. Right? We love to help people. We don't always love to help their dogs. And he said we had a very nice rug, not like a luxurious rug, but a very nice rug in that room. And that dog decided that was going to be his bathroom. And he says when they finally moved out, just the smell of urine, and what it was for them, an expensive rug, was just so strong. He said, I actually took it somewhere to get it professionally cleaned, and they just told me up front, we'd be robbing you if we tried to clean this. We're not really going to be able to get this smell out. And so he talked about having to, get rid of this rug. So we know that to care for others really can cost us something. Another story I love is out of a devotional that is one of my favorites, called Theirs is the Kingdom. It's from an inner city minister called Robert Lupton. And he talks about having a Bible study in his house. And, he's an inner city ministry. He didn't make a lot of money anyway. And he didn't have a lot of nice things, but as a lot of men will do, he had gone out and bought a very nice chair. It was his chair. His kids didn't sit in it. His wife didn't sit in it. It was his chair. He took time to make sure it bent where he bent. And so he loved this chair. Well, he talks about a Mrs. Smith who was coming to the Bible study. She was elderly and, a part of their community, loved, but also old enough that she had some incontinence issues, some other things. He says, wouldn't you know it, the very first Bible study, where did she sit? In my chair. And she quickly declared it her chair for every Bible study from then on out. And he said he really had a crisis of soul, because he's like, Lord, I give up so much to be an inner city minister. I'm not a pastor who makes a lot of money. I don't have a lot of nice things. All I have is this chair. And now it's like you're asking me for the chair too. Have you ever had those moments with God? And yet, if we are stewards of the kingdom, is it that Jesus says, okay, all of the things you have are mine except for that chair, that one thing. No, we do, but we do have to constantly be reminded, don't we? It all belongs to him. And that's a hard lesson. I mean, I've had that trouble as well. And so we go back to the book of Acts, this challenging passage from Acts 4. All the believers were one in heart and mind. No one claimed that any of their possessions was their own. So that's the stewardship idea. It all belongs to God. But they shared everything they had. With great power, the apostles continued to testify to the resurrection of the Lord Jesus. And God's grace was so powerfully at work in them that there was no needy persons among them. For from time to time, those who owned land or houses sold them, brought the money from the sales, and put it at the apostles' feet, and it was distributed to anyone who had a need. And so this is a powerful image, isn't it? Now he gives us some warnings. I think the two warnings are helpful. He says, one, there's a sense in which some Christians have said this is how we are to live all the time, in every way, in every situation. The challenge is, if you've ever been in a part of a community that tried to live this out, is this very easy to do for very long? No. There are some Christian communities that try to do this. There was a Mennonite community in Waco that I knew folks in that community, and they owned their own homes, but they all tried to live in the same neighborhood, and so it wasn't like anybody could just come live in your house, but they wouldn't all buy a lawnmower. So like 1 or 2 people in the community would buy a lawnmower, and then they would share the lawnmower. And it was things like that. And really cars, it wasn't, we tend to, my family's there, got 4 people in my house, I got 4 cars. They didn't do that. They, lived in such a way that you could borrow each other's cars. But that's really challenging. If you've ever tried to do even that in a little way, it quickly is about issues of fairness, issues of things like that. And you see that in the book of Acts. By the very 2 chapters later, you got people arguing about which widows are being taken care of. And so that happens. What does he say the other trouble is with this passage? Well, that's one error we make with this passage, but what's the other error we make with this passage? Well, it can fall into legalism, yeah. And then what would be the opposite of that? We just ignore it. And think, well, that's too hard, so we don't have to do anything like that. Which really gets back to, we think everything we own belongs to us. And so this passage should challenge us of, how do I share my possessions with others in ways that benefit, here especially, the community of God? And we've seen a little bit of that this week. Most of us actually don't own chainsaws. And so the handful of folks who have chainsaws have been asked to really help a lot, which I have a need for that this Saturday if anybody has a chainsaw involved too. Not for our church, but a sister congregation that needs some help. And so it is reminded that. It also is just this idea of a theology of enough. This is a huge challenge for our culture. So when is enough enough? I think who knows if it's true, but there's the old illustration where somebody asked Rockefeller, when will it be enough? And his answer was, just a little more. Yeah, just a little more. Just a little more. I've heard a similar thing with a group of people, and I've used this illustration before, but they were talking about, can a Christian ever build a house so big that it's sinful? Everybody in the room was like, well, probably, sure. And then the speaker read, well, how big? What square footage house becomes a sinful house? And everybody was all of a sudden really quiet. Until finally somebody was honest enough to pipe up, when it's bigger than mine. And we have that attitude. So there's struggle. What is enough? But also, you get this theology of enough, there has to be some balance here. We don't want, he talks in the chapter about, we don't want to idealize poverty. Poverty in itself does not make you more righteous. Many people live in poverty and are as greedy as people with much. They just don't have the means to feed that greed. But they sit and they stew and they wish that they had all day long. There are also people with much that their hearts have not been sullied by that much. They are generous people and they give well. I've been doing a lot of study on the book of Joseph for this sermon series, and it's Joseph is a person who he is shaped by a season of great impoverishment, even enslavement, but also spends much of his life with a lot of wealth. Pharaoh says, all that I've got, it's yours. You can do with it what you want. And yet, he maintains his righteousness even in that prosperity. Now we know, the Bible warns us, that prosperity comes with its own unique set of temptations and dangers. But by itself is not necessarily a guarantee that we will give in to those dangers. The challenge is, how do we live with enough, with contentedness? Paul gives us this too, right? In the book of Philippians, he says, I know what it is to have much. I know what it is to live in want. I have found the secret really to both, which is I can do all things through Christ who gives me strength. It's interesting, we quote that about soccer matches for whatever reason. Paul's saying, no, I know what it's like when my bank account's full. I know what it's like when my bank account's empty. I have enough in both circumstances because I have Jesus. And so for us, it's learning that. Now, how do we do that? Well, one of that practice is just generosity. There were times, it happens less here, my office is further back, but in San Angelo, there were just more instances where the person who came off the street asking for money could get to me. And you do. You got to be you got to be discerning. We had, just like here, we had ministries that really did a good job of helping the poor, and there's wisdom in pointing people in those directions who can help address systemic issues in their life and not just immediate needs. But every now and then, right, there'll be somebody and I'll be like, well, let's go down to the gas station and get you gas. And every now and then, you know, the secretaries for people who could keep me accountable, they're like, what are you doing, Taylor? Why are you doing that? And one of my answers, honestly, very often was, it just keeps me honest, right? I mean, I preach this stuff. If I don't ever actually go help anybody, I'm you know, and if I only farm out help to other people, then I'm not actually obeying Jesus. And so there is a sense in which we want to do a check on our lives. Do I just think I'm generous? Or are there moments when I'm actually generous? We want to practice it in our lives. Again, it doesn't mean emptying our bank accounts necessarily. 2 Corinthians 8, Paul's having this discussion about giving. He's asking them to give. He says, I do not mean that there should be relief for others and pressure on you. There's this, you know, he's not saying give to the point where all of a sudden you're in need and we've got to take up an offering for you. But he says, but it is a question of fair balance between present abundance and their need, so that their abundance may be for your need in order that there may be a fair balance. It's this idea that God may be blessing you for this very moment to help this person in need. And so it's a call for us to live lives of generosity. We're going to speed up just a little bit. He says, you know, one, we got to discover the joy of giving. This goes credits to my father-in-law. And we were visiting one time, and he said, you know, there are lots of moments in my life where I've had buyer's regret. You know, we bought something, it didn't live up to the hype. We're like, man, I wish I did not buy that. Or we buy something and it breaks really quickly. Or if you're like me, you get a stain on it the first time you wear it. Lots of buyers. Anybody in here ever had buyer's regret?
Sue hasn't.
He said, I've never had giver's regret. Now, he doesn't mean that he's never been taken advantage of or he gave something, but he said, I've always, once I've given, known that's in line with what Jesus wants me to do. Even if somebody takes advantage of us, that's really their sin, not ours. Right? And God calls us to be generous. And so when we give generously, if we're allowing God to do a work in our lives, it should remind us over and over again of the generosity of God. And that's what gives us joy. Now, he does talk about doing this. We have to live wisely. We're not made up of infinite funds. And so how does margin, what he calls it margin in one place, he calls it frugality in another place, how does it help us become generous people?
We have the extra.
You've got something to give. Most Americans, I forget what the stats are, I would look it up for a sermon, but I didn't look it up for this. Usually on average, Americans spend more than they make. Most Americans are carrying some level of debt. If you have debt, that means you have obligation to others, and God wants us to meet those obligations. I've known some Christians who thought, well, I just won't pay those people back. Well, that's certainly not in the way of God either. If we've made a promise to pay somebody back, we need to pay them back. God is truthful and generous. We need to do both. But if we always live in debt to others, when a need comes up, we don't actually have the capacity to give. And so it requires, if we want to be a generous person, we got to build into our budget margin so that we can give to others. And so we do that in lots of different ways. Alice and I have been very blessed, essentially, by the families that raised us. So she grew up in a family that tithed. I grew up in a family that tithed. I can remember my very first allowance was $1, and that made the math very easy. My parents were like, you get 10 dimes. One of the dimes goes to the church. I forget what amount they had me save. It was a couple of dimes or something. And then the other dimes you can do what you want with. And every time they raised the allowance, we talk through, here's what it means to give. Here's what it means to save. So that really all of my life, I have been a tither, which means every paycheck I got, from the very beginning of my budget, I wasn't having to figure out, well, how do I give away this percentage of my income? That was just built into the budget. Really, the discussion was, how do I live on this other amount? Unfortunately, I married somebody like that. It can be really tough if you marry somebody who doesn't have that background, and now you're trying to sort all that together. So Alice and I, this is not to our credit, this is really to our parents' credit. We were in a when we first married, we went to a church. I was not on staff there. That church was about to go into a building campaign, and they do what churches do on building campaigns. They started listing, not who gives what, but they started saying, if you give this amount at our church, you're in the top 5% of givers. If you give this amount, you're in the top whatever. And what was shocking to Alice and I, at the time, I was not working. I was going to seminary full time. And she was a second-year school teacher in an impoverished district in Waco, Texas, making not a whole lot of money, but we faithfully tithed. It put us in the top 5% of that church's giving. Yeah. And so it wouldn't here, but there it did. But again, because there are probably lots of people in that church that were in similar economic situation to us. The difference was, and again, I'm giving this credit to our parents, because if we had been raised different, it would be very, very difficult to go, how am I going to carve out 10% of my budget to give to the church? Because most of us tend to spend what we get. But if we're frugal, then it opens up margin. Now, so this is the challenge for us. I don't want you to walk out thinking I'm bragging, because I'm not. I think God always calls us to raise, we always talk about raising our standard of living. We're good at that. In Allison's family, they call it creeping excellence. And have you ever heard that phrase? So you decide to get new curtains, and those are great, but as soon as you get new curtains, you realize the carpet's kind of dingy. And so then you got to replace the carpet. And as soon as you replace the carpet, you figure, well, we need to probably get a new one of these to creeping excellence. And creeping excellence can take all of your money away from you. And so it is this challenge in our life. Instead of having constantly saying, how can we raise our standard of living? It is this question of, how can I raise my standard of giving? And just so you know that I'm not trying to get all of your money from the church, for Alice and I, it's important for us to give our tithe to the church, but also over the years, we've tried to increase our standard of giving to ministries specifically that help the poor. That's a very clear commandment of Scripture. It wants us to do both. It wants us to support our church with our tithes and offerings, but we also are called to help the poor. And so for us, it's, okay, God's blessed us with, my very first church, I was doing my taxes, and I get, I'm on there, and I realize I'm getting the Earned Income Tax Credit. I don't know what that is. And so I have to look it up. And so I call Allison in the room and say, Allison, hey, guess what? We're on welfare. Because we were making so little, and we had a baby. It was really Sophie that threw us over the edge, and got us there. And so we've been there, like Paul. I've known it to be in one. Now, we had a family structure and everything. We were never in danger of not eating. So there's some difference in the poverty I experienced and the poverty other people experienced. But now, you take care of your ministers here. And so I'll just be honest, I have more money than I ever dreamed that I would have as a pastor in this field. And so it is a challenge of, how do we increase our standard of giving? If God has blessed us with abundance, how do we give even more? And that requires frugality. Allison would be the first to tell you, she's the frugal person in our family, and I am not. And so this is a lesson for me of, I love a good deal, but you don't always need another good deal, you know what I mean? There was a time where I came home with a shirt, and she's like, I think you already own that shirt. And I said, yeah, but it's $3. But part of frugality is I don't actually need two shirts that look just alike, even if it costs $3. Because that $3 could be done what? It could be given for somebody else. And so this is, if you ask Allison, frugality is a lesson I'm constantly learning. You'd think growing up I would have learned it, but. So he says it's not just about money, though. And this is a thing that I would say for sure. Generous people are generous people. So people who are generous with their money tend to also be generous with all the other things that God has given us. And when we learn to be generous with all the other gifts that God has given us, it becomes easier to be generous with our money. And so what are ways that we can be generous beyond the gift of our finances? Time. In fact, sometimes it's easier to be generous with our money than it is to be generous with our time. You can always make more money. Can you make more hours in a day?
No.
You cannot. Yeah. So that's hard. He gives the example of even his own daughter. The people we love the most, we sometimes find it difficult to be generous with our time and our energy. What else?
Talents.
Talents. He talks about that. Very interesting. He says you can't always say yes to everybody. This is talking about being frugal with your talents. in that if you say yes to everybody, what tends to happen? You burn out and you lose generosity. So there is that sense of being frugal with our talent. What else? What other ways we can be generous?
Your energy level.
So energy level, yep. We only have so much energy, don't we?
Yeah, I think in the book you call it, like, as your soul, so like being a friend or spending time with your family, your energy.
Kindness is a form of generosity, isn't it? We don't think it takes a whole lot of effort to be kind, but it does sometimes. And so, what does it mean to be kind to others and generous? If we cultivate a spirit of generosity, really that ought to exude in every area of our life. And Jesus tells us again, you think of the woman who gave the 2 mites. Generosity is not the amount you give. Generosity is really what it costs you to give. And so all of us are called to generosity, no matter the amount of money in our bank account. So this is his, I know we're running out of time. This is his challenge. Be frugal, then generous. That's just probably a good lesson for our culture. Because is frugality a value of our culture? No longer. It used to be, but it's not. When I was studying this, it really brought to mind Gene Wofford for me. So those of you, and some of you know Gene Wofford, but Gene Wofford passed away this last year, one of our Sunday school teachers, longtime New Testament professor at Houston Baptist when he was there. And Gene loved to play golf. And Gene would invite me to play golf on occasion. And I would go with him, and Gene would always say, I'll pack you a lunch. And Gene's lunches would always be, I don't think he owned a Ziploc bag. They would be in the bread bag, like the bag the bread came in. It felt like Gene somehow found loaves that were only the heel of the bread, because it would be the heels left, and it would be bologna, and he would have a styrofoam cup to pour the Coke in that he brought for me, and it looked like the styrofoam cup had been used like 42 times. And so I'll be honest, I was like, I'll buy us lunch, and, but he grew up in a generation where frugality was valued, and because his generation had lived through times of great want, and you learned how to be frugal. Our generation, I mean, if you're my age or younger, you really have not lived through that kind of society-wide want that those who are older have. But that's dangerous, isn't it? Because are we in control of the economy? No, we're not. So seasons of want could come again, and most of us do not have the skill set of frugality. And yet Jesus is asking us to practice frugality, not just in preparedness for seasons of want, but so they might be generous. So this is frugality with our time. It's interesting. He says, look, most of us spend a lot more time during the day doing things that don't matter than we realize. So our phones are just masters at capturing our time. The TV screen, the computer screen, there are all sorts of things like that at the end of the day, we spend a lot of time on them, and they don't accomplish anything. We even think they're relaxing, but the truth is they're not genuinely restful. And so what does it mean to be frugal with that time? How can we do less of that, be frugal, so that we might spend more time generously with others? We think of families. It's really good practice to have times where the phones are somewhere else so that you can pay attention to each other. With your talent, this was pretty interesting and challenging too. If we go and go and go and go and go with our talents, eventually we burn out and there's not anything else left to share with others. I'll be honest, taking off last Sunday, I was in town. I took off. Scotty had asked for some opportunities to preach. He's a good preacher. We want to cultivate that gift. He's going to be, if the Lord lets us both live a long time, he's going to live longer than me because he's younger. We want to cultivate the skills and talents of God's people. So he's preaching again this week. I'll be at church this week. But some of that was so that I could spend the time I normally give to sermon prep on long-term planning. And part of that is a stewardship of gifts. And also, I'll just be honest, to sit in a worship service and not be in charge, which I did last week. I just went to a sister church. You don't understand that gift unless you've been there. And so it's just a gift for my soul. But it's hard for me sometimes to let go of that. I'm not an overly control freak, but I still like to be in charge on Sundays. So that's part of it. And you might think about, what does that mean for me? And then with your treasures, obviously. What does it mean to maybe cut back on something? It's gonna be something you like. We don't tend to spend money on things we don't like. Well, we do, but those are the things we have to spend money on. How could you cut back? How could you be frugal in order to share with others? You know, so I think it was Wesley. He quotes Wesley all the time. I'm surprised he didn't quote Wesley in this chapter. You know, Wesley was really impressed. Like, look, make as much money as you can, so that you can give away as much money as you can. And so it's a helpful lesson. It actually goes well with a chapter I'm reading. Swindoll that does a series of books on Bible characters. So I'm rereading the Joseph book, and he has a whole chapter on, we tend to demonize the wealthy sometimes, and God doesn't demonize the wealthy. God sometimes blesses us. We can't equate wealth with blessing, but sometimes our wealth is a sign of God's blessing, but it's meant to be shared with others, and God needs those people. The church wouldn't exist without those people. The early church benefited from generous people. You know, you get the story of Jesus and the disciples, but in the background of Jesus and his disciples are really some wealthy women who supported his ministry. They don't get much attention, but they're there, and so we don't want to demonize anyone, poor or the rich. God loves them both. God can use them both, but both have to live with generous spirits. All right, we'll close there. Kind of lecture more than discussion this week. Sorry about that. Just give me preaching. That's because I didn't get to preach Sunday. Well, we'll see you this week. We got a special baby dedication on Sunday, and we also Scotty's going to preach again on Joseph, and then I'll close Joseph up the next week. Y'all have a great day.
Thank you.
I haven't watched it yet, but he always does some feedback. I'm gonna watch it and get feedback.
Delivery and
Yeah, I want my granddaughter to get up. I've got one more year.
So she's getting close.
Yeah, so I mean, that passage is really saying, well, here is,
Oh, you got that.
What do y'all have, that sounds good.
Whatever.
whole rest of it.
But no, it says it's open. Well, next time you have
Oh, and see.
And he did change his text font to allow for text. We may as well do this. That's kind of what I did before we went on vacation. I was like, I hope there's
How are you? I know, it was being a little bit, and then my dog was like, because it was pouring. Yeah, and she's like, no, mama. Hanging on me, I'm like, oh, here, give it to me. I spoiled the dog, she's like, here, have a treat, go away. It breaks up and goes all the way. All the storms just missed every time. Well, now, no, you get me over here. But that happened, second storm. At least it I know, we have a lot of people. Maybe so, yeah, it's like 23rd or 24th of August. Okay, yeah, the next week. Started in that's the truth, about right, something like that. Yeah.
You got a lot of.
Supposedly, we have the biggest bed is the bedroom. Because I asked Jill if Jen's not interested. My husband does not do well in the little alley room.
Where did you move to?
Franklin.
To Greatwood. So should be here for breakfast.
Yeah, they ride their bikes over.
Oh, okay.
Hello.
We'll have to compare.
How are you doing today?
Yeah, how about you?
Ours too.
We're going, on a rail cruise.
Yeah, I think all going is that.
Start next Tuesday.
The challenge is to create a whole document.
I'm just doing whatever Karen planned for me, because Karen and I what planned it, and I'm just running.
Hey, that's the best
We
way.
did-
You don't have to
we
do
did
anything but
it.
We
show up.
ended in, I think Germany, and then we're flying back, they're going on another trip.
Oh, wow.
It's
Wow.
like 10 days as long as I can stay gone.
You gotta go see those grandkids.
Yeah.
Yeah, we were like, we need to hurry up and leave dedication.
You'll be pushing them up the aisle.
How are you?
But I think Jesus is calling us, we already know what to do.
Well, we just had a very good friend.
Thank you. I just wanted to tell you, I chaired a financial partner last building.
Yep.
And it was, we had one of those consultants come in, and well, they said now, yes, one person.
Well, yeah.
And we're gonna have these dinners ahead of time, so before we go. So I said, okay,
Yeah.
no problem, I can plan for parties. So we got home, so that was a breeze here. It was like, don't worry about the food, you pay for all of it. But then when we started working on the invitation list, I said, send this out, but I don't use it. They said, we send it to the top leadership, Sunday school teachers and stuff like that in the church. And then the top, I don't even remember like how far down it should go, but on the giving. And so Gary, I did that list, of course, it's all in alphabetical order. And all I do is just kind of put people that are age-wise and stuff so they'll enjoy their evening. And I had somebody call that I knew very, very well. And they were young, and they called me and said, we've just received an invitation, and this is not possible. And they said, could you tell us, we just, we feel like we shouldn't be going. And I said,
See, you're still so
yes,
young.
your name was on the list, and I noticed it because I knew you. And I know you don't teach. You've only been married about 2 or 3 years. And I said, and I said, so they were just like, they said, we just can't believe it. When we see these other people around us, that they were just shocked.
Yeah.